Thank you, and I'm sorry for the delay. We had some technical difficulties which now seem to be resolved. So the first paper in this afternoon session is co-authored by Dr. Eleni Korka S.M.Shariat-Panahi. Dr. Korka will be delivering the paper. Dr. Shariat-Panahi received his undergraduate degree at the University of Tabriz in Iran. He went on to receive his MA in Thessaloniki and returned to write his PhD to Athens here on the history of Thessaloniki. He's currently working on a project in Ottoman Corinth. Dr. Korka is an archaeologist of national and international standing. She's currently serving as the head of the General Directorate of Antiquities and Cultural Heritage. She has previously served as the head of the Department of Greek and Foreign Scientific Institutions, Organizations, and International Affairs, head of the Directorate of Prehistoric and Classical Antiquities, head of the Directorate of Documentation and Protection of Cultural Objects, and head of the Inspectorate of Private Archaeological Collections. She is also an active and working archaeologist herself. She is most known to us at the American School for her work down in the Corinthiad. She is an author of 150 articles and studies, as well as the director of about 35 international exhibitions and conferences. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Korka.
Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, the 18th century Ottoman history was marked by the increasing intervention of Western European states in the economy and politics of the empire as a result of the capitulation signed by the High Court. The rivalries among these Western states, particularly France and England, had often important repercussions on the internal political affairs of the Ottoman state and led to open hostilities and antagonism for securing privileges and rights by the Sultan. In order to understand the extent to which economy influenced politics in those days, it suffices to examine the case of Athens at the end of the 18th century and the beginning of the 19th, which finally led to the deprivation of the Parthenon from a major part of its sculpted decoration. Earlier, the Orlov Revolt in the Peloponnese, 1770, and more incidentally, the broader Russian-Ottoman War of 1768-1774 led to the invasion of southern Greece by Albanians, followed by extensive destruction and by an unprecedented economic crisis. As a result of this crisis and of the disruption of commerce, a large number of Greek Orthodox merchants owed money to their French counterparts and business partners. The French merchants, several of whom were permanently settled in Athens, owing considerable assets, pleaded the Ottoman government to intervene, and the French ambassador of court, none other than Count Marie-Gabriel-Florent-Auguste de Choiseul-Gouffier, managed to obtain from the Sultan a firman ordering the Athenians to pay their debts to the French, or else their properties would be confiscated. The community as a whole was held responsible in case individuals could not meet with their obligations. The Ottoman authorities in Athens got to the point of hanging 3 members of the community in order to force the rest to pay. However, this goal was never achieved, as the local economy and those with a leading role in it were completely destroyed. The persistence with which the French pursued their financial goals in the period of 1780-1790, however, generated a grudge in the Athenian population against them. This grudge was probably enhanced by that, during that time, the French seemed to have a cultural expansionist policy in what regarded the Athenian antiquities. The aforementioned ambassador had also appointed in 1784 Louis François Sébastien Fauvel as his representative in Athens in order to depict and collect items of archaeological significance. Fauvel collected antiquities for himself, as well as sold some to foreign museums. He had even created a small museum near the Acropolis. Gouffier urged Fauvel to gather as much as possible. Among the objects of strong interest were the Parthenon sculptures. Fauvel managed to gather certain pieces from the rubble around the Parthenon, but no removals were allowed from the monument. The change of tide in the French politics generated by the French Revolution affected Gouffier, who fled to Russia, but not Fauvel, who settled permanently in Athens, pursuing his goals unimpeded. Yet the situation changed abruptly towards the end of the next decade in a way unfavorable to the French. The rising power of Napoleon Bonaparte and his expansionist policy caused a rupture in the good relations between France and the Ottoman Empire. In 1797, the French became masters of the Ionian Islands, and next year they invaded Egypt and tried to set foot in the Middle East. The Ottomans reacted vehemently and formed a coalition with the Russians against the French. The British, eager to secure their own position and waging war already against Napoleon, aimed at strengthening their relations with the High Court. After all, the British-French antagonism had already reached its peak all over the then known world. Back in the rather backwater city of Athens, right after the declaration of war between the Ottoman Empire and France, September 9, 1798, the local Ottoman administration, under order of the Sultan, proceeded to incarceration of French subjects in the city and to confiscation of their properties. Among them was also the painter called Fauvel, who sent at least 5 different letters to the Ottoman government pleading for his release. The confiscated properties were then sold to Ottoman subjects, among which several prominent Orthodox Christians, such as the official interpreters of the British consulate at Athens, Spiros Logothaitis and Georgaitis Fotopoulos. It is good to remember this yard because right here, the Parthenon marbles, as they were taken down from the Acropolis by a cart which the French secured, were packed in crates and then sent to the Piraeus. It is within this political situation, in 1799, that Thomas Bruce, 7th Earl of Elgin, became ambassador of England to the High Court, a position which he maintained until 1803. In order to help the Ottomans with their campaign against Bonaparte, among other things. Influenced by the famous William Hamilton, governor of Naples, he employed Giovanni Battista Luzieri, a renowned Italian artist, to make drawings of the monuments on the Acropolis of Athens, apparently following Fauvel's footsteps. Supposedly, you can detect him with a voivode right where this ladder is. As officially no foreigners were allowed within the Ottoman fortresses and the Acropolis had been turned into a Turkish garrison, Elgin needed to acquire a special permit from the Sultan to allow Luzieri and his team to enter a military zone, which fell under special protection. Knowing that the French would be a hindrance, Elgin decided to over-exaggerate the threat that the French population in Athens constituted to the Ottomans in order to get rid of them. Thus Elgin finally opened the way to Luzieri. However, Lord commander of the Acropolis, and the voivode, governor of the city of Athens, demanded a special firman for Elgin's men to enter the fort. The history of the removal of Parthenon marbles has been, and still is, an issue of long debate and strong contention between Greece and Britain. This is not the place to analyze all this. It is interesting, however, to follow the way the foreign powers intervened in the political, economic, and social life of small, degraded Athens due to its unique antiquities. One thing is for sure, according to the existing material. There was uneasiness, uncertainty, and unrest in regard to the legality of the removal of the sculptures by Lord Elgin among all involved parties. According to British argumentation, documents which were issued by Ottoman officials of the High Court in connection to the marbles after the first supposed firman of 1801, truly an unofficial letter of recommendation which Elgin exploited in order to remove sculptures from the monument, are the ones which finally gave Elgin coverage for all that he had done on the Acropolis. Today, we will present for the first time new and important evidence which has come to light in this regard. During the first years of Elgin's activity, a few other foreigners were also active in Athens, such as Danish Dr. Mertrude, who quarreled with Luzieri over his illegal acts, or passer-by Russian Prince Dolgoruki, who wished to enter the Acropolis to draw, but Luzieri, under the instructions of Lord Elgin, managed to make things so difficult for him that in the end he left the scene without understanding what was going on behind the walls. The removal of the marbles occurred between 1801 and 1804. Elgin left office in 1803, but ordered his team to continue its work. Things changed, however, as the ambassadors who succeeded him were not in favor of continuing the plunder. Sir Robert Adair was one of the successors of Lord Elgin at the British Embassy in Constantinople, positioned there in 1808. Quite a few years had gone by since Elgin had left his post to travel back to England. However, unexpectedly, he had fallen captive to the French during the Napoleonic Wars, was held prisoner in France, was released after 3 years, and had returned to England in 1806. Through painstaking and outrageously costly efforts, he managed to get hold of the cases and boxes of the first part of his collection, scattered in various ports in England during his absence, or drawn from the shipwreck of the island of Kythera. Here you see on the left the Mentor, the personal ship of Lord Elgin, which was overburdened with sculptures, especially Parthenon marbles, and which sank off the coast of Kythera. Furthermore, he was continuously looking for a way to bring to England the second part of his collection, which had for years been trapped in Athens and had immense difficulties leaving the Ottoman territory. Things in Athens had become complex since 1806, as the power arena was constantly changing in the broader Mediterranean. The Ottomans were at one time allies with the English, and at another with the French, while the Russians switched sides, confusing things furthermore. This checkerboard of interchanging alliances and enmities had its effect in small Athens. The two main powers, English and French, impersonated through the protagonist figures of Fauvel and Luzieri, launched their local war, a war of sheer conflict of personal interests. Fauvel, who had been obliged to leave Athens, had come back in 1803, waiting for a chance to regain the reins of the political scene. From England, Elgin envisaged a raid on Athens with the help of the British Navy in order to get the marbles away, while at the same time Fauvel could not, even if he managed to finally get his hands on the marbles, send the collection to Paris without the help of a French vessel. The behind-the-scenes activity in this regard was fervent. Things, however, remained stuck until 1808. Luzieri wrote Ambassador Adair that he needed firm arms in order to ship the marbles to England. In 1809, Luzieri managed to embark the marbles on a hired ship, having secured the consent of the voivode. Yet, it seems that someone informed the port, and an order was hastily sent to Athens prohibiting the ship to leave. Adair was asked with great persistence to intervene and get permission from the port in order for the marbles to be released. However, the Ottomans informed Adair that Elgin had no right in the first place to take the sculptures. They clearly stated that all the events and actions which took place in Athens, and particularly on the Acropolis, for 8 years on behalf of Lord Elgin were totally illegal. This reaction was very revealing. The people in power in the Ottoman administration had all changed since the time of Elgin, and for this reason, whatever they said at that time to Adair must have been the clear truth. This meant that no valid authorization was ever granted for the removal of the marbles, and that there was no official knowledge of what was going on in Athens either. In 1809, a peace treaty was signed between England and the High Court, ending the 2 Years' War. This helped Adair in his negotiations for the embarkation of the marbles. Yet, it does not seem to have been enough to solve the issue. In 1810, Adair had to offer presents amounting to 1,480 piastres and 100 English pounds to officials in Constantinople, as well as a very generous present to the Kaimakam, the value of which is not mentioned. Adair finally managed to manipulate the embarkation of the antiquities on the 20th of March, 1810, after a document was sent from the Kaimakam to the voivode in Athens. The feelings of the people in Athens, according to novelist John Galt, were against Elgin, and Fauvel raised havoc in order to prevent the departure of the marbles, stating clearly that no authorization was ever given to Elgin for the removal of the marbles. Yet his protests were to no avail. For years and years, these later official documents were considered to be lost. The Greek Ministry of Culture had sent Professor Ioannis Alexandropoulos to search for relevant documents in Istanbul, but at the end of the 90s, the archives there were not yet well organized. Recently, historian Shariat-Panahi, who is here in the third row with us, after a collaboration we started, searched the archives and discovered some very important documents coming from the second phase of Elgin's collection. These texts are very revealing and disperse certain theories which have been formulated due to their absence, meaning that when a document is non-existent, researchers usually speculate on its content and may attribute to it much more than what it really holds. In the case of the history of the removal of the Parthenon sculptures, every document is considered as an element of legal documentation. The British argumentation has definitely used these non-existent texts as de facto assets for legalizing and sanctifying Elgin's actions in retrospect. The difficulty with the 3 newly discovered documents is that the dates which are attributed to them are administered by the archivist, probably according to context. However, these dates clearly do not seem to correspond to the existing historical evidence. Document 1277/49-548, dated April 6, 1810, is probably a letter sent from the Kaymakam to the Sultan in order to persuade him to allow the marbles to depart from Athens. It must have been written after the aforementioned generous bribe Adair offered him, because there is great eagerness in it to persuade the Sultan. Therein, there are many discrepancies in regard to the historical truth, such as the fact that it mentions that Elgin bought the marbles, which is definitely not true. However, since both the Sultan and the Ottoman officials had changed in the meantime, it would have been easy to persuade them. The text is difficult, lacking clarity, as it mentions previous events and documents in a complicated fashion. However, this is very common with Ottoman correspondence, which favors rhetoric jargon against accuracy. What is clear in this text, at least, is that there is no mention of marbles coming from the buildings of the Acropolis, giving legality to their removal. On the contrary, they are referred to in a derogatory tone as stones with images or effigies. It is possible that this is what the Kaymakam was told by Adair. It seems most probable that the letter was prepared by the Kaymakam sometime between the 18th of February and the 20th of March of 1810, when the so-called Firman from the Kaymakam, who was Hussein Kamil, addressed to the voivode in Athens, arrived allowing the marbles to leave. The date, April 6th, placed on the document by the archivist is definitely wrong. Two other letters were also discovered, which, even though dated by the archivist January 14th, 1812, are probably much earlier in date. The one, 1277-49-548b, perhaps dates to 1808, when the British were at war with the Ottomans. And that is when Luzieri, who had fled Athens, came back to retrieve the marbles, as well as the ancient vases he had collected for Elgin. The letter, which is a copy of an order issued by the Grand Vizier to the voivode in Athens, specifically mentions the existence of ceramics and that there was obstruction of their transportation. The vases Luzieri had collected had at some point during his absence been confiscated by the French. Perhaps these are the ones that are mentioned. The denial for transportation, also mentioned, perhaps refers to the embarkation of the objects Luzieri had managed to achieve in 1809, but which finally failed. If so, the letter may be the one which finally allowed the transportation of the marbles in 1810. In any case, the objects referred to in the letter are characterized as some broken pieces of marble with images and certain ceramics which belong to the ambassador. What is really interesting is the jargon. The vizier refers to these objects as unacceptable in Islam, but acceptable in the European countries. Reading between the lines, one would trace an effort of the vizier not only to diminish the value of the Renaissance sculptures, but also to stress that these are objects unfit for an Islamic environment, probably a good excuse which he needed to find. The second letter, 1277-49-548a, from the voivode of Athens to the central government, is more difficult to interpret because it mentions the British ambassador who lives in Constantinople and has a collection of marbles and ceramics. which should be given back to him and allowed to leave the place where they were stored outside Athens. However, during the time of Elgin, there were no confiscations or difficulty for transportation of the marbles or other antiquities. It is probable that it does not come from the time of Elgin, but much later. It may date to 1808, when Luzieri was asking there for funds to regain all the confiscated goods and transport them to England. However, the language used is so complicated that the text cannot be taken for granted. Yet, here as well, there is no reference to any permit or legalization for dismantling the Parthenon. In any case, in order to analyze and interpret the content of these letters, one should carefully compare them to all the existing material connected to the issue. In no other way can one hope to discover the historical truth. In regard to the transportation of the antiquities from Athens, a few remaining cases with marbles were also shipped in 1811. In the meantime, a large number of dilettanti and other travelers, I'm sorry, that was the translation of the letter, and other travelers flocked into Athens. They were immediately engulfed in the Luzieri-Fauvel feud, and almost all vehemently disagreed with the despoilment of the Parthenon. Actually, Luzieri used the previous efforts of the French to remove certain marbles as a pretext of what Elgin finally managed to accomplish. Many texts the foreign visitors have left us give interesting details in regard to the negative feelings they had toward the removals. On the other hand, the travelers themselves caught the antiquities collection fever, and many of them departed with an antique souvenir in their suitcase. This was the time when certain foreigners from different countries joined in groups and achieved the removal of the frieze from Apollo Epicurus in Arcadia, as well as sculptures from Achaea and Aegina, with the purpose of selling them to the big European museums. Lord Byron visited Athens at that time and became so strongly sensitized on the issue that he composed the first poem against Elgin, especially after having traveled on a hydra. The ship, which is on the right, the ship which transported the last cases with marbles to Malta. It is very interesting. The marbles were on the ship, Lord Byron, Luzieri, and a young Greek, Nicolas Giraud. The existing texts offer very useful information for the small society of Athens, the behavior of the downgraded population of Greeks and Turks, and of English-French intrigue over the antiquities. As both agents lived in Athens, even in their old age, they became part of the history of the city. In these later years, some sensitized Athenians through the Philomeus Society, which they founded, attempted with the help of the patriarch to put an end to the loss of so many antiquities. Luzieri's actions were never forgiven by the Athenian society, with Ioannis Venizelos being the first to put this in writing. Texts as the one that were presented here today, above all, bring to light the role of the big powers of Europe at the time, France and England, which competed with one another in the small degraded town of Athens, as they saw fit to exploit the rich, unprotected heritage that existed by taking advantage of a rundown system with corrupt officials in order to create their colonialist museum system, which still tries to rule the world cultural community even today. Thank you very much for your close attention.
In a moment, we'll have our last paper,